Trying to end the Gulf dispute, first a breakthrough, then a setback, as Qatari and Saudi Arabia leaders talked for the first time on ending the blockade. Within minutes, more talks were put on hold. What went wrong, and is dialogue still possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Al-Barra. It was their first phone call since diplomatic relations were cut and a land, sea and air blockade imposed more than 3 months ago. The Emir of Qatar and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia talked by phone on Friday, but hopes of a breakthrough were quickly put on hold and more talks suspended, apparently because of a dispute about protocol. The setback followed Donald Trump's offer to help end the crisis. We'll hear from our expert guests soon, but first our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, reports.
Tremendous optimism over the fact that the White House had successfully coordinated the first official contact since this rift between GCC partners erupted, the rift that has now been in place for many, many months, this phone call that has taken place between the Emir of Qatar and the Saudi Crown Prince. But what happened after that phone call seems to be what has caused so much consternation. The fact that there is an accusation by Saudi Arabia that, in fact, the Qatar's news agency misrepresented the facts, failing to, in the eyes of the Saudis, report that it was the Emir of Qatar that initiated the phone call to Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince. This has led to accusations, in fact, that Qatar has misrepresented the facts of the phone call, the facts about any sort of dialogue, not serious about dialogue, and even, in fact, that there is concern on the part of Saudi Arabia that Qatar will continue its so-called previous policies. Now, we know that Qatar on Thursday reiterated that when it comes to the list of the 13 demands, what is not negotiable is any sort of discussion on the infringement of Qatar's sovereignty or of freedom of speech. This has been well received in terms of the mediator in these discussions, the Emir of Kuwait, saying that not all 13 demands will be acceptable. And it seemed that, in fact, there was a glimmer of hope that things were moving forward. But now, as a result of the accusation by Saudi Arabia that Qatar has misrepresented the how this phone call came about between the Emir of Qatar and the Saudi Crown Prince, that now there is a doubling down of defiance that there will be no further talks.
Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us on the panel here in Doha, Abdullah Ba'boud, Director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. In London, we have Andreas Krieg, Assistant Professor at the Defense Studies Department, King's College. But let's first talk to Mohammed Jaham Al-Kawari, Qatar's Ambassador to Spain. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us. Let me ask you this. We had the phone conversation between the Emir of Qatar and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, and then suddenly, minutes later, Saudi Arabia is saying that it's suspending talks with Qatar. Can you give us an idea about what's going on here?
Well, it was a very positive conversation, and thanks to the initiative of Kuwait and the efforts of President Trump. And later on, we have to inform our public opinion of what happened, and there was a declaration in our news agency, and I think later on, unfortunately, there was some declaration from the Saudi part. Mm-hmm. But we understand that we are living in a crisis, and usually on this kind of situation, there is ups and downs. And the most important thing, we want to see good intention from our brothers in other GCC countries to see that they are willing to find an end for this crisis.
Ambassador Kawari, the phone conversation is still seen by many as a move forward. This is the first time leaders from Qatar and Saudi Arabia talk since the start of the crisis on the 5th of June. Are you confident we might see some breakthrough in the near future?
We are confident in the initiative of Emir of Kuwait because he's exerting a lot of effort and putting a lot of time. And the same time, we see from the other side there is American effort, and the international community want to see an end for this crisis because it's not serving the interests of any country or any party. And we have hope that our brothers in the GCC will understand, this is the time to come down and sit down around the table and negotiate, because this is the only thing. And Qatar said this in the first day, and anything they want to discuss, we are ready to discuss, except the things which is violating our sovereignty.
Mr. Ambassador, there are some scheduled meetings in New York as the United Nations is bracing for the General Assembly meeting. Do you expect some sort of rapprochement between the GCC leaders the moment they convene there?
No, rapprochement is necessary, I think, and in the end, all of us, we have to be negotiating and sitting on the same table, and because this is an issue that's affecting the interests of the whole countries in the region and the whole countries in the world. And I think we are in Qatar open for this dialogue, and we want to see an end, because it's important to see this escalation of campaign against Qatar to be ended, because what they are doing now, it's no one was believing that we will reach this point, and we are in the same organization, which is the GCC organization, and we have to work to develop our region instead of getting in this kind of situation and creating a lot of crisis and conflict.
Ambassador Mohammed Jaham Abdulaziz Al-Kawari, Qatar's ambassador to Spain. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you. Let's now go back to our guests, Dr. Abdullah Ba'bood and in Doha, and Andreas Krieg in London. Let me start by asking you this, Mr. Ba'bood. So within few minutes, there was a sense of breakthrough in the region and then a major setback. Do you think this is just a squabble over protocol, or there are different, deeper layers to this conflict?
I think the blockading countries were not really intending to negotiate. They want to prolong this for at least some time. They haven't achieved anything from this blockade to bring them back to the table. And I think they are embarrassed. However, they were pressurized, in my opinion, by the public opinion, by international consensus, but also by the call from the President of the United States. And I think following that call from Trump, the call took place. I think they were just looking for any pretext to delay it. And you have to remember that it's not just one country. There are 4 countries that are blockading. And I think there are also some differences between the other 3 countries, because the Crown Prince said that he was going to consult with them. I think that the protocol, or what was said or reported on the national news agency, I don't think that should be used as a pretext to stop what is going to be an important talk to resolve this crisis and this conflict in the region.
Mr. Krieg, what's your take on what happened yesterday?
I agree with what Abdullah just said. I mean, this is a clash over narratives, and I think yesterday we've seen for the first time that this clash over narrative actually takes precedence over actual diplomacy. And, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen this entire spiral of narratives and counter-narratives kind of spiraling out of control. And what happened yesterday was a very minor issue, I think. Who called whom didn't really matter, because it's actually very important that they actually started talking. It doesn't matter who made the first call. But there are forces within Saudi Arabia who are not interested in bringing this to an end very quickly. And these forces might not be Mohammed bin Salman himself, but there are certain people around him. Most importantly, I think Mr. Qahtani, who is in charge of government communication, who was very quick to denounce the Qatar National News Agency report. And it kind of shows that the Saudis, especially Mohammed bin Salman, now are in a place of an inferiority complex. They need to show that they are strong, and they need to show that they're winning, and they're looking for a face-saving measure to get out of this conflict. And it obviously shows, for them, in their eyes, shows weakness that he made the first initiative to call the Emir, but it didn't really matter. So, and I think this is I think the key problem here, is that we are now so deeply bogged down in this clash over narratives that real diplomacy, real facts, and real interest don't really matter anymore.
Mm-hmm. There's this issue of, Mr. Babu, there's this issue of the domestic considerations which Krieg was referring to, but also people are talking about the differences between the key players among the quartet. Many believe that ultimately it's the United Arab Emirates that calls the final shot, and therefore if they're not on board, there's absolutely no way this whole crisis will come to an end.
Yeah, I think the United Arab Emirates is definitely a key player in this conflict. Along with Saudi Arabia, I think Bahrain and Egypt have different reasons to be there, but they don't necessarily they're not necessarily playing a very major role in this. So there were people saying that perhaps Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, called the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, and perhaps there was the disagreement there. There is definitely a clash of narratives, as Andreas said, but also there is a clash of interest here. Qatar is a growing country, it's a developing country, it's competing in some ways with the United Arab Emirates. And I think in the United Arab Emirates, they want to see that Qatar does not compete with them, and they want to keep it down. Unfortunately, this is not something that can be achieved through this blockade. It doesn't help anybody. It really goes against the conscience of the people here who want to work together, they want to collaborate, they want to see the region developing together. A little competition is always very healthy. However, I think between Qatar and the Emirates, there is this competition that perhaps leads the United Arab Emirates to follow this.
Mr. Krieg, the phone call came after Trump said that US President Donald Trump said that he was willing to mediate. Do you think that the Americans now are stepping in and playing a bigger role in this crisis?
It would be great to see the Americans taking more responsibility in this crisis, because it's their interests which are at stake as well. We've seen already since Tillerson came to the region more than 2 months ago, or around 2 months ago, that the Americans are willing to boost the Kuwaiti position and the Kuwaiti mediation effort, and they've really done that. It has been quite counterproductive that the White House wasn't on the same page as the State Department and the Defense Department, but it seems now that they have convinced Trump that this is the right way forward, and I think Trump did a good thing in stepping forward and making these phone calls and trying to bring people on to the table. Issue being that Trump doesn't have the kind of legitimacy and credibility that someone like the Emir of Kuwait might have, because he doesn't understand the relationships at play. But on the other hand, he's still the President of the United States, and the country that everybody in the GCC looks towards as a protector, and that means he has a lot of leverage. And I think the Americans can put pressure that Kuwait, in its current role within the GCC, cannot really play, because the Kuwaiti mediation effort is one that is very much focused on the personal position and relationships of the Emir.
Mr. Baboud, it was quite also interesting that President Trump now, his statements are now more balanced than before when it comes to the GCC crisis. His last statement was saying that, asking all the countries to follow through on the commitments of the Riyadh summit when it comes to defeating terrorism and cutting off funding for terrorist groups. What can the Americans do in practical terms to de-escalate the tension?
Well, I think the Americans actually played a very important role initially in escalating the tension, especially President Trump and his tweets and his media talks that he was blaming Qatar for the crisis. But I think over time, the Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Defense and the players who are and who understand the region, especially Tillerson and the Ministry of Defense Secretary Mattis, I think they have brought him back to understand that there are intricacies here in the region, and he shouldn't do and say the things that he's been saying. Now, and I think that he's now becoming very moderate in his tweets and in his talks. He's also facing a lot of problems internally, domestically. There are a lot of issues that he needs to face, but also globally, as a leader of the global leader, he's facing issues with Korea. He's facing issues with North Korea, and he's facing issues with Russia and so on, and Iran. And he does not need another problem here in the Gulf states, let alone the issues with fighting terrorism. So he needs
to solve this one
out. And there is a very important role that he can play if he wanted to do so.
Mr. Krieg, I think ideally the only place where you can have everyone come together is basically New York, where there's going to be the United Nations General Assembly meetings. Do you think that could be the ideal platform to bring together all the different countries to set aside their differences and negotiate a settlement?
Ideally, I think the UN should play a big role in this. But I think these international organizations in this dispute is similar to the GCC. I think the UN is a toothless tiger. It's very much a giant that doesn't really function well. The fact that naturally the GCC countries should go towards their institution, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, and try to solve it there. The fact that they didn't do this shows that they're not really believing in international organizations. And I think because this is not a dispute really just about interests. It's about narratives. It's about personal relationships. And that goes a lot deeper than just 2017, a lot deeper than the last Gulf crisis, 2014. I think what we need is a mediation effort, and I think the Americans have understood that this is the way forward. Tillerson, when he was in Doha, made it clear that they will concentrate now on trying to find a way out with the Saudis and the Qataris and leaving out the United Arab Emirates for the time being, because the UAE have more at stake here in terms of, they have more interest involved in keeping this going. The Saudis don't have an interest in keeping this going. And quite on the contrary, Mohammed bin Salman needs to find a way out of this crisis that is face-saving. And I think the way out will be a solution eventually whereby Saudi Arabia will find a way to talk to the Qataris and then present it as Mohammed bin Salman is the one who solved the crisis. He's probably going to be king very soon, and it would be a great way of introducing him as the hero who solved the Gulf crisis, because a lot of the stuff that Mohammed bin Salman has going on domestically, which is the Yemen war, the Agenda 2030, these issues have all been disasters for him. He hasn't really been able to score any victories. So if he can go and show that he's the hero of that crisis, I think that will work well for him domestically.
Well, speaking of the way out, Mr. Ba'boud, we're talking about a list of 13 demands that were presented by the blockading countries. They still insist that these are prerequisites for any settlement. Qatar, on the other hand, says that those demands infringe its sovereignty. How can they make concessions about this?
I think it's difficult to go to the negotiating table with a prerequisite, with a list of demands. And Qatar, especially those list of demands that are particularly made not to be accepted. They do infringe on the sovereignty of the states and the legitimacy of the ruler. So I think if there was going to be a way out, and I believe that there is going to be a negotiated settlement, that's the only way out of this crisis, is to go without any demands and to go to the table and go back to the previous agreement that was signed in 2013 and 2014 and start from there as a basis that you can build on. Anything that they want to discuss, I believe Qatar is ready to negotiate and to discuss about them. They have no worry in Qatar, as the Emir had already mentioned, that they will open all the books and they can discuss anything that they wanted. However, don't come with your demands and tell me, this is what you have to do, and you have to agree them before the negotiation. So what do we go there to negotiate for? I think there has to be a change of mind, a change of perception of how this is going to play. And I think Qatar is ready to negotiate and willing to negotiate.
Mr. Krieg, the crisis has been described as unprecedented, a blockade, described by many as amounting to a declaration of war against Qatar. Do you believe that even if this is solved in the near future, the old political order in this part of the world will continue to be the same?
I don't think so. I think it will push people, it has pushed people already across the edge. This is the first time this is not just a dispute over between different governments, but it's been as well as it's been very much a conflict between people as well. And with social media involved and the media and with alternative facts involved, we've seen a lot of the people being dragged into this as well. And there has been a humanitarian cost as well on the Qatari side. Families being, for the first time, really being separated. Or even though they have the same tribe, they can't really see each other. These things will have an impact on the psyche of Khaliji people, of Gulf people for generations to come, I think. And I think the longer this blockade stays in place, and Qatar will continue to build alternative routes out of this towards East Asia, towards Turkey, Iran, the more the GCC becomes obsolete and the more the Gulf as a security complex as such becomes obsolete. And I'm very pessimistic that things will ever go back to how it was before. Also for one reason, the GCC was founded by Saudi Arabia in a completely different environment where Saudi was really the leading country in this part of the world. Now, the Gulf has changed. You have the UAE, who is very powerful with their own ambitions. You have Qatar with its own ambitions looking forward. And it's a lot more primus inter pares. Saudi is one of the leaders among many. And I think the GCC has to be completely reconceptualized in order to move forward. As it is now, I don't think it can continue to exist.
Is the crisis going, Mr. Baboud, going to further consolidate the GCC or disintegrate the GCC? Or do you see any regional realignments in the near future here?
Well, if the crisis continues and prolonged for a time, I think, as Andreas was saying, we're going to see a realignment which is already taking place, where we can see that Qatar has started to open routes, open a relationship with Turkey, with Iran, but also with far beyond South Asia, etc. And also there are other GCC countries that would start to think, when are we going to be next on the next on the list for being blockaded, if we disagree or if we make any policy that they don't like in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. So I think the wounds that this crisis is going to leave are going to be really deep, not only in Qatar, but also among the people in other GCC states. I think the trust has now been lost. To regain that, it will require a lot of time, but also it will require that this conflict is resolved as quickly as possible before the wounds become too deep and too difficult to repair. The region does not require further disintegration and doesn't require further crisis. As we know, we are surrounded by conflicts around us.
Speaking of the conflicts, let me go to Krieg. Krieg, in less than half a minute, do you expect countries like Iran and Turkey to play bigger role in the region because of the divisions among GCC countries?
Absolutely. I think a weak GCC, as Abdullah said, will always strengthen Iran. I mean, a weak GCC will be definitely playing into the hands of Iran as the other bigger power, and as a weak GCC will undermine the power of Saudi Arabia. It is in Saudi Arabia's interest to actually unite the GCC in order to maintain their position in the region. And I definitely think that Iran will go out of this crisis strengthened.
Andreas, Krieg, Abdullah Baboud, thank you very much indeed for your time. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahbar, and the whole team here, bye for now.